Last year, Gallup polling, they found that the majority of people in the world experienced positive emotions. Of course, some countries and regions experienced kind of more positive emotions than others. According to John Clifton, who's the managing director of the World Gallup Polling Organization, a person's financial situation is one of the 5 factors of well-being or affecting well-being, and far from a conclusive happiness indicator. 9 of the most content countries had estimated GDPs of less than $15,000 per capita. In Lithuania, for example, the third most miserable country, GDP per capita was over $22,000. Whereas on the other hand, Nicaragua, the third most content country, only had a GDP of $4,500. So just to give you a breakdown of the top 10 countries that were deemed the most happiness, starting at number 1 and going down to number 10, you have Paraguay, Venezuela, Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, Kuwait, Guatemala, the Philippines, Honduras, and Switzerland. So only one kind of traditionally Western nation there at the top. And Clifton went on to explain that the dominant presence of Latin American countries within that top 10 list does have a cultural explanation. He says that residents of Latin America tend to have strong communities and spend a great deal of time with their families. There's a similar phenomenon in the US where one of the biggest drivers of well-being is time spent with family members. So what about the most miserable place in the world? Going from number 10 down to number 1, the most miserable place in the world, we have Azerbaijan, Armenia, Belarus, Georgia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Yemen, Montenegro, Serbia, Iraq, and Syria. So Syria was deemed the most miserable place in the world, and there are some obvious reasons for that. But 3 other interesting stats. The largest increase between 2011 and 2012 in terms of happiness was Singapore, that saw an increase in overall happiness, as this poll called it, of 24%. The largest decrease between 2011 and 2012 was in Syria, that saw a 14% drop in its overall population happiness. And just to put things in perspective, the US and the UK were ranked 25th and 26th out of all of the countries that were asked. And just to give you an idea of the methodology, they were based on telephone and face-to-face interviews, and there are about 1,000 adults in each country that are asked, aged between 15 and older, and it was conducted in 143 countries. So US and UK, they're certainly not number 1, because I know Americans always like to be number 1 in everything. Well, you're 25th in terms of happiness. So in terms of going back to, number 25. But in terms of kind of the happiness and Clifton's explanation, it goes to show that is this a case that money doesn't buy you happiness, and kind of the overall driving factor, and certainly in the American economy of capitalism, the more money you have, the happier you will be. Is this a case that money doesn't buy you happiness? Is this further evidence towards that case, Jeff?
I might actually agree with that, because you said one of the major factors of the Latin countries being happy is family time, and that sort of makes me think of how in America we don't exactly do that. We have all of this material wealth, and we have all of these luxuries, but what time do we have to enjoy them? A lot of people work 50, 60, 70 hours a week, 1 or 2 jobs, and some people work 3 jobs just to get by. You don't get any time with your family. You don't get any time to spend doing leisure time, right? And I'm sort of surprised that a lot more European countries that allow more leisure time weren't on this list. That kind of surprised me a little bit, because you would think with a little bit more time you'd be a little happier. But nonetheless, I think that generally it's true. Like, money doesn't buy happiness. As long as your needs are met, as long as you can meet the needs of your people, I think people will be more or less happy, and as long as they have time to spend time with their families.
Yeah, just before we go to hang on, just before we go to that, I just want to point out that in terms of that overall polling, to what Jeff said, you're surprised that the more leisurely European countries, so Spain traditionally has this afternoon siesta where they have an hour's nap or 2. They were kind of above the US and the UK. They were kind of in the 20s, kind of 15, 16, kind of low teens ranks. So they were overall a bit happier than the American population. So just to put that out there, Nick.
I could possibly touch on some of those factors that Jeff talked about. First, I want to get to the most miserable ones, because those are probably the ones that actually mean the most to me. my ancestry is Ukrainian, so it's just half of my ancestry is from right around that region, so I kind of pay more attention to that spot, and also the Balkan area, because it's such a messy issue. But I think a lot of that goes back for centuries. There's been a lot of tension between the various peoples of those regions. Azerbaijanis are very untrusting of Russians, and Georgians and Armenians, of all three of those groups, and especially of Turks. Belarusians, they're not very fond of Ukrainians or Russians, and all vice versa. There's a lot of long histories of demonizing the other, and I wonder if that sort of history can translate into a sense of, and also Russia overall has been a very big factor in why some of these people might not be very happy. The Russian sort of corrupt system of capitalism there, especially, is very steeped in bribery and crime, and low legitimate pay, high illicit cash flow. As for, and I mean the same thing in some ways could be said about Central America, but except for those points that Jeff touched on and that you mentioned, Stephen, the notion of family community, I think there's higher in Latin America. And the reason I think those are higher than they are in the more developed world countries is because I think money and cash flow and a burgeoning middle class actually inbreeds contentedness for the first generation, and then ambition in the following generation. For example, you had in the 20th century, you had cars became a big phenomenon in the early 1910s and 1920s, and they died off for the Great Depression. 1940s and 50s hits, everyone starts buying cars again, but there's still a luxury item. Then the baby boomers show up, and suddenly a car is a necessity. Everyone should have a car. A car is not a luxury anymore. A car is a staple of a household and a family unit. And I think that there's some merit to that argument being why maybe we're not as happy as some of these other countries, is because we've lived with wealth and sustainability and contentedness for so long that we don't know what it's like to not have things and have to make do with what we have, and then to feel better when we do have things.
Right.
Can I do this?
Okay, sure.
Before Dan might steal my thunder. Nobody's pointing out what the actual cause of this is. Weather, tropical climate, happier people. It's really, really simple. There's a reason why out of all the states in the United States, people kill themselves in Washington State more than any other state. It's weather. Like that's what it is. Like it's all tropical paradises, and the miserable ones, besides like Civil War. North Korea wasn't on the list, so I'm sure they're like the #1 happiest. But like Syria's Civil War, so crazy, horrible circumstances. But most of those countries in the top 10 have shitty weather, and they live near shitty Russia. Like we have, or not we. I'm talking about Central America has beautiful weather. Like what's not to be happy about? And Switzerland has Nazi gold, which we already established, so that's why they're on the list. But yeah, it's weather. Like, can we just say it is weather?
Dan?
I just want to say so currently Canada's 15. So just so you know, Nick, we're not. We can frown, but I was looking at this list. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know, like these lists. There's so much clickbait in the world now. Gallup, what are you basing this on? I don't really get the formula, so. I mean, I guess my overall column is just like, it's great fodder, but what does that mean? Or are you happy? How many times they actually measure laughter on this as well? Like, so I don't know. It depends on your honesty of who you call up, I guess, or who you get to respond, right? I mean, it's interesting to see, as Sean said though, like who is in that top 10 and the climates. But then once you get out of the top 10, you got Denmark, Norway, Canada. So you start to get some winter folk into that mix in the top 20. So it can't be all weather. Sean, it can't be all weather.
There's a wealth factor in it, but like if you look at the top 10, obviously living in a comfortable climate is huge. It's even bigger than money, apparently, because it's fucking.
Yeah, but if that was it, Canada would be like at the bottom.
No, but I'm saying
same with the UK.
Then money.
Hold on. Come on. You live in Toronto and I live in London. Our weather is as good as Northern California and as good as New York. We cannot say Canada would be at the bottom, especially when Ontario has one of the highest populations of the whole country. We have, when most of us are concentrated in that smaller and warmer strip, we have some damn good weather here.
have you been other places? I'm just saying. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to get into that. I was being semi-tongue-in-cheek with the fact that Canadians are constantly complaining about the weather. But, yeah, I mean, the ice storm that I went through in Toronto this year makes me want to question you for the rest of the show. But nevertheless, the whole thing with this is, like, it's great. Everybody likes to talk about it. But I definitely think that if there's, like, a real concrete conversation to be had, it is work and versus wealth. And one of the things that Nick brought that I thought was really interesting was it's so true if we want to talk about our North American culture, and I'm sure this expands to most Western countries, is the idea of what is classified as need. And one of the most ridiculous examples of this that will happen every September, now the school's just letting out, every September, back to school flyers are ridiculous. Like, what your kid needs to get back to school. Really? Like, the most expensive tablet? Really? That's what they need to get back to? Like, they're going to be okay. But that's no matter what it is, right? Like a holiday. Like, how many tent poles we've set up to drive the economy, because our economies now are basically, we don't make much in North America. We're solely based on either, in Canada, obviously oil is a big thing that's causing us tons of problems, but also it's just the economy. It's debt. We're living in a debt culture, so you got to buy crap, people. Snuggie up, because that's how we're going to get through this whole thing. And so I think you're right. The economic factors of need versus what you actually need is a really interesting point.
Yeah, I think that Van brings a really good point in that this poll, it's rather measuring happiness. It's an unquantifiable nature. I mean, you can get general senses, and I think most of us would agree that obviously Syria, since between 2011 and 2012, of course that would have seen a huge drop in the happiness of its population. Places like Iraq, of course they're going to be miserable places to live in. And I mean, I'm sure there'll be religious people saying, you look at South America, all of those countries, they're highly religious kind of populations. It must be religion. Well, no, as Dr. Clifton said, that there's 5 different factors. Money plays a part, the amount of kind of leisure time that you have as well. But just as Dan said, it's impossible to quantify. But at least these sorts of polls give us a good idea of where we don't want to go and spend the rest of our retirement. Any final points?
North America just needs to look at holidays. That's all I'm saying. It is crazy how few holidays we have compared to the rest of the world.
I can agree with that.
Weather and Nazi gold. Final point.
I also want to mention Chinese crap. We base our economies on Chinese crap as well.
I think most of the world does at this point. Even the hand-me-downs that often circulate to poor countries.
I don't think we discriminate what country's crap, Jeff. I'm just saying.